I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for joining us for another MassMedic virtual program. It is incredibly good to see all of you again, at least virtually. I'm Rachel Robinson, Vice President of MassMedic, and I really appreciate you joining us for what I know is going to be a very interesting program this morning. So before we kick things off, just a few housekeeping notes. We absolutely encourage questions, so feel free to use the chat option at the bottom of the screen and pop your questions in there throughout the program. We'll do a lot of Q&A at the end, but if there's anything super relevant, you know, the speakers will be keeping an eye on that chat box just to make sure we answer questions. From a sound perspective, please keep yourself muted unless you are asking a question. At the end, you can also use the raise your hand option in the box, and we'll call on you to ask your question. But just to limit any background noise and be respectful of the speakers, just make sure you're on mute. I think we've all had some fun experiences virtually lately with noises in the background. I know my train just went by. But other than that, I again just would like to say thank you for joining us and turn things over to David and Joanne from Milliman. We are incredibly excited to be presenting this program with them, and I know you're going to learn a heck of a lot. So David, Joanne, take it away.
Thanks, Rachel. And we are excited and looking forward to getting to know you a little bit as we go through this presentation. So my name is David Williams, just a couple of quick introductions. And I'm a Milliman consultant, and I've been with Milliman for about 22 years. I do a lot of work with real world data in helping hospitals and device manufacturers, pharmaceuticals, payers, insurers, understand how alternative payment methods work, how ROI studies work, and have done a fair amount of those. And Joanne, Joanne is from our London office. Joanne, do you want to introduce yourself really quick?
I will. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. I'm very excited to be able to join you. So I'm Joanne Buckle. I head up Milliman's health team in the London office. I've been with Milliman for almost 20 years, 19 years and 10 months. I spent a bit of time in the New York office of Milliman. That's where I started with Milliman, and been back in London for the last 18 years. I work quite a lot with insurers and governments, not just in the UK, but in Europe, Middle East, and Asia. We're doing an increasing amount of work with providers who are looking to contract with the various different types of payers in a multitude of different ways. So I'm looking forward to getting to know you all a little bit today, and yeah, I hope you enjoy the presentation.
So we thought we'd start really quick with who is Milliman. Some of you, as I've mingled with you when we had a chance to mingle last year and years before, some of you know what an actuary is. Some of you may be wondering, and especially you might not have heard of Milliman as an actuarial firm. So we're one of the largest actuarial firms in the world. We're a global company spread throughout the world, US, Europe, Asia, Australia, South America, Africa. We work with many of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, and we do a lot of value-based contracting in many places. So a couple of things that actuaries do, we focus on quantifying and managing risk. If there's one word that goes with actuaries, then with Milliman, it's risk. The other word that goes with Milliman is independent. So we adhere to a strict professional and ethical standard, and Milliman is fiercely independent in their analysis and will provide you the best answer. Sometimes it may not always be the answer that you're looking for, but it's the answer that is an independent and accurate, well-done answer. A couple of other things that we do is a lot of data behind us to perform our work. We are very, very data-driven. We do a lot of risk adjustment, predictive modeling. We do a lot of contract analysis, reimbursement mechanisms, ROI studies, disease management programs. The full gamut of healthcare finance can be found under the purview of one of the 1,000 healthcare actuaries that work for Milliman somewhere in the world. So that's a little bit. If you have more questions, go to milliman.com. There's a lot of information there and a lot of good studies that you can refer to. So if you're going to take risk, then you probably need an actuary, particularly as a healthcare provider. We've been told that by several Milliman clients, actually. So in this session, what we're going to try to cover are reasons that you might attempt a value-based reimbursement contract or an alternate payment method or a risk-based contract, whatever term you want to use to define that. Some key concepts that drive the value and the metrics. We're going to go through two very simple examples to give you a flavor for what that looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the risk that is involved that you need to be aware of. We're going to try to cover that by the bottom of the hour, and then we'll turn the time over to Joanne, who will then give an international perspective on how these contracts work in Europe and in other places. So that's our agenda for today. As mentioned, if you have questions, put them in the chat section. We have a couple of our staff are monitoring that. They can respond in line or bring it to our attention and we can address it. So why would you want to move away from a standard fee-for-service, simple fee-for-service reimbursement methodology? What are the things that device manufacturers or pharmaceuticals think about when they consider an alternate payment method? So we have identified three. The first one is that you have a new product and you're new to the market. So this would be a situation where you're adding value to the market. When we think of trend, we think of these are the technology advancements that lead to increased cost in healthcare overall. So you're not necessarily displacing anything. You're adding a new treatment to the market, but your treatment or your device or your pharmaceutical, whatever it might be, is expensive. And so in order to gain traction and to get some market share, you might look at ways to do something other than fee-for-service as part of your pricing strategy. The second one is that you have a device and you've got a comparison to another product and you want to compete with them. So you want to increase your market share at the expense of a competitor. And to do that, and your product again is expensive, and to do that, you might enter into a value-based contract that replaces the competitor's product with the hope that you would increase the volume for it, but there may be some risk that's entailed with that in order to gain that market share. The third one is that you have an existing product and you have a new indication perhaps for it. The FDA granted you a new indication. You want to move sideways into a new market. Any of the other two would be two previous reasons to go in would be a consideration for how you would do that. But that would be a third way to think about how you would enter into a value-based contract. So one thing that we have learned as we've done these is that the methodology for the contract or for the pricing is unique to the product and to the population that it applies. The most common characteristic is that you're going to be taking risk. In other words, if you're going to say that I'm going to save money, I have an ROI study or a clinical trial that says I save money, then you may be being asked to put your money where your mouth is, which is part of what drives that. But the bottom line is that when you've seen one of these, you've seen one, and they all tend to have unique characteristics. It's hard to, although some of the general characteristics are common, the analysis is very unique to that particular situation. Two types of risk, not a surprise, there's upside risk. So you're given a bonus for favorable experience. We'll cover one with ED usage. If you reduce the emergency room department usage, you get some money back. The downside risk is that, okay, so you're going to get paid your preferred price, but if you don't meet that emergency room usage goal and that benchmark, then you're going to have to give some of your money back. So that's downside risk. So you've already received the money, but you are at risk for writing the check back as part of the contract. One thing to point out in Massachusetts, and while we haven't seen this in many other states, in Massachusetts, if you take downside risk, you're required to file an actuarial certification. with the insurance department, as you are effectively becoming a mini insurance company. And if you have significant risk, then they will scrutinize that to some extent. We can add more information on that if you'd like, but downside risk in Massachusetts may have a regulatory component as well. So reimbursement models about risk. So this is sort of a continuum of the types of risks that you might take, ranging from your standard fee-for-service all the way up to full capitation. Most of you are going to be familiar with this. So in the middle here is that second shared savings component, is where a lot of these alternate contracts take place. And they can take many, many different forms, but their shared savings losses in some form is usually where you start. Now, having said that, I have seen and I have done analysis for full capitation for a medical device. So it's not unheard of, particularly if you're going to contract with a large staff model like Kaiser, who love to do capitations. You may be asked to at least consider a full capitation for your product. So that's sort of the continuum of risk that you might take. So what are some of the principles that would be applied? This is a simple but effective definition from the CDC. The goal of value-based insurance design is to decrease the cost of healthcare while increasing the effectiveness of health services. So part of what you're trying to accomplish, and you may have an ROI study to benefit it, but you're trying to say, I want to be paid a premium for my product because I'm saving money in the healthcare system as a result of using this device or this drug or this treatment. So, so that is really what drives many of these contracts. Some of the other key concepts are that they tend to be high value, meaning that you're going to be targeting services that are expensive: emergency room usage, ICU, hospital days. You may be looking at other treatment replacements that are expensive, but they're high value, and the patients tend to be using a lot of services. So the selected clinical diagnosis is typically the COPDs, diabetes, cancers, things of that nature. So the other two pieces of this that are of interest are that when you're taking risk, if you remember, for those of you that remember the 80s and the managed care backlash that occurred from the capitations and risk-sharing arrangements that were made back then, there is often a requirement to include a quality outcome as part of the criteria. The intent of that is to not create adverse incentives, financial incentives that would damage the healthcare of the individual. So you don't want to be taking away care that's necessary. You want to be sure that the quality of the care is still at a high level, regardless of how the financial incentives are aligned. So that's got to be a component of risk sharing that is part of this. And also, you may be wanting to target the other third rail of the cost, and that is the patient behavior. So there may be some behavioral health components of it that you would include in your measures as well. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. These, you're all familiar with these. These are the typical conditions that are targeted, or treatments for these conditions, and devices that apply to these conditions that we would be focused on. There are potentially many others, but these are the typical ones that we see. And these are the conditions because, as we mentioned before, they're high prevalence. There's a lot of potential for high cost complications and sequelae that are involved. There's also a lot of comorbidities associated with these patients, which can muddy up your measures depending on how you do it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So the value comes in low cost, high value interventions, but these are where the opportunities lie for value-based type of contracts or alternate payment methods. not sure exactly where to put this slide, so we'll just put it here, but there are a couple of gatekeepers in the process that to be aware of. The first one is group purchasing organizations. So if your device is sold primarily to hospitals for hospital use, then you'll be familiar with the group purchasing organization gauntlet that you might have to run through. This could actually be an advantage to you because one of the hurdles that you will have to overcome when contracting directly with a hospital is that you may not have enough volume coming through for any particular hospital to avoid natural volatility. And that natural volatility would be a reason not to do a value-based contract and risk share arrangement. But if you can get the volume up by pooling it over multiple hospitals through a group purchasing organization, that might be an avenue to a contract that would work for you. One of the things you need to be aware of is that not all hospitals will be treating patients, the same types of patients, depending on your device. So a community hospital who treats typically lower acuity patients might have a little bit different arrangement than a tertiary care center that's taking all the riskiest cases. And so how you distribute that money, depending on the risk, there needs to be some risk adjustment associated with it. Your technology committees and health plans are also gatekeepers in that they will label very expensive, unproven methodologies and devices as experimental until proven otherwise, and you have enough evidence to support it for treatment. But you may be able to overcome some of that by clearly demonstrating the value of your product, and then entering into a contract where you put yourself at risk in order to gain some traction and market share, even though it may be somewhat experimental. So that's another gatekeeper and another hurdle that your contracting strategy may be able to potentially work with. And then there's the regulatory and also sort of discussion hurdles with payers and decision makers about how cost effective your device is. In Europe, there are particular, and Joanne will get into more of this, about studies that need to be done in order to support the effectiveness of your product. In the US, it's less regulatory, but there is a sort of an expectation that you demonstrate cost effectiveness if you have a high-priced product, and that it not only be clinically effective, but it also be cost effective. So some other key metrics: how many patients, how expensive are they, what are you trying to avoid, and can you measure those endpoints? Or said another way, you might be able to measure them, but can you measure them in a way that supports a contract and a financial exchange of value? So these are the value propositions that we reviewed before. So let's say that you claim you will prevent hospitalizations. Well, notice that this is an avoidance, a prevention of something that didn't happen. So you need to measure something that didn't happen. So you need a good benchmark. And that benchmark needs to be pretty solid as it relates to the population that you're addressing and all of the risk adjustment that goes along with that. So that's one of the challenges that you would have with that. The second one is that so your product works as effectively or better than another one. So the question here might be, how will this information be captured and gathered? One of the risk components of your contract is going to be data and reporting, that it's accurate and that it is clearly defined, so that the end of the day, when there's $1 million check that needs to be written, that if one of you disputes it, you can go back and say, we gathered the information according to the contract. It was a robust data gathering, and it meets the criteria. So that becomes a very important component of the contract, is how you measure the output and to make sure that you can do it accurately. So the other piece is that you've demonstrated your comparative effectiveness using a clinical trial, randomized controlled trial. But the thing to realize here is that, as you know, the real world is not a controlled clinical trial. And when this is used in the real world and out in the wild, what is that going to do for your measures and what kind of variance might you expect from that clinical trial, and at what point does that create a risk for you when entering into a risk-based contract. So let's go through a quick, just a very quick and simple, but I think informative, a couple of examples. So let's suppose that you have and we'll pick a brand new wearable continuous glucose monitor. And you say that it's going to reduce your emergency room usage by 10%. And you're going to charge $500 for the device, $500 per whatever. Maybe it's $500 a month, but it doesn't really matter. So your competition has a similar device. It's reimbursed at $475. So you've got a $25 premium on your device. So you're considering a value-based contract, and it's the upside risk only. So the insurer says, okay, I'll reimburse you the same as your competitor, but you have to reduce your emergency room usage and meet that goal. And then we will give you the additional $25 per unit. Okay, so the way that would work out financially for you and for the insurer is that the top two lines are you and your competitor. You can see that you're expecting $500,000. The emergency room expenses is expected to be $1 million, so that's $1,500 in total outlay. For your competitor, it's $1,475 because they're a less expensive product. Now, for you, let's suppose you meet your target. You reduce that emergency room usage by 10%, so the insurer only pays out $900,000. You get a $25,000 bonus. That's the upside risk. So now you've been made whole at $500,000, but the insurer only paid $1,400 as a result. So they got a good deal, and it's a better deal than the competitor. Now let's suppose you didn't meet the target, so you didn't get your $25,000 bonus. They paid out $1 million for emergency room usage, and they stayed the same as the competitor. So there was no damage done to the insurer. So the insurer is interested in an upside risk only because potentially, if your product does what you say it does, they're going to end up in a better position. And if it doesn't, they're not going to end up any worse. So now let's talk about downside risk. So same contract, same $500 device, same emergency room expected 90% savings, or 10% savings in emergency room usage. So what is your risk? Now you're going to be put at risk for the emergency room usage of that $100,000. So same format. The top two are very similar. That's your expected values for you and your competitor. But now, if you met your target, then you received your money. The insurer paid $900,000, and they get their $1,400 just the same as before. But now you didn't meet your target, so now you've taken that $100,000 at risk for that emergency room visits that occurred but shouldn't have based on what you presented to the payer. So they're going to cut your payment down to $400,000. In other words, you have to write a $100,000 check. The insurer still remains whole. They still get that $1,400, that $1.4 million. So they're going to come out whole either way when it's downside risk, and it's you that's taking the risk for that reduction. Now, it's critical to understand that setting that value of the emergency room is very, very important. And you need to also understand the natural volatility and the trends that would be associated with those conditions. So volatility is a very important concept in the risk, managing the risk. And volatility is related to a number of different factors, the biggest being just the size of the population that you're addressing. And the other one being just other components that may contribute to the variability, including the relative risk of the population and how that plays out, and any other unforeseen circumstances that might be related to the treatment. So in a good example here, just to kind of drive this point home, this might be emergency room visits for a population of people with diabetes. So there's about one visit per person per year kind of thing. And they tend to be that population. That population is, even at a large level, some years you might only have 0.8 visits per person, but some years it might be 1.13. So you can see kind of how that is naturally distributed. And then the cumulative distribution is on the right, where it just builds up over time. And you'll note that 68%, or 2/3 of the time, the number of visits exceeds the mean of 1,000. And so going back to the example here, setting that 10% reduction, if you kind of do some quick mental math, you will see that depending on the size of the population, that could vary considerably depending on the population that you're addressing in your contract. The second piece is trend over time. So not only do costs go up typically over time, average cost per service, but also there is the utilization trends that may be affiliated with your population. Perhaps there's drivers of emergency room visits up over time. In diabetes, it may be that you just have increased obesity in the population that's occurring naturally, and so the emergency room visits over time are going up as a correlation. Or there may be other treatments that are applied that are not part of yours that are driving those treatments down, the visits down over time, and you need to adjust for it for those other components that are extraneous to what you have. Or it may be just all over the place, and you need to understand sort of the volatility that might be occurring from year to year in a natural sense. So trend is an important component for analysis in conducting these as well. And then the last part is just the demographics of the population. We sort of alluded to that. And this involves risk adjustment. So at the end of the day, one of the things you don't want to have as an open item is addressing that ever-present question, well, my patients were sicker than yours, so I shouldn't pay you this much money back, or you should be paying me that much back. So you need to address that component of it in the base population before you enter into the contract as well. So putting this all together, we define the population very carefully through diagnosis codes and other definitions and codify that. You define the services that you're going to be addressing, and then you learn how to measure those. You look at the trends, you set a baseline, and you look at where you're going to be in the next 2 or 3 years and understand the drivers for that and try to codify that. You adjust the population, and then you put in place your strong monitoring and data gathering processes so that you're accurately measuring the results, and there's no questions at the end of the day about what the results really are. So those are 5 steps. They seem simple on paper, but actually doing them can be fairly challenging when you put that all together. So that is sort of my summary. And with that, we'll turn the time over to Joanne to talk a little bit about how some of this is applied in the international markets.
Thank you very much, David. And actually, David, I'm going to ask you to go back a slide before I start to that slide, because I think it's also relevant to one of the questions that one of the audience was asking. When David said these are not as simple as they first appear, if you sort of take that statement and you inflate it by an order of magnitude, you'll have some idea of actually how you might do some of these things in some of the countries in Europe. And when David said I was going to talk about sort of international considerations, I don't need to tell you that they'll be different in every single country, and obviously I'm not going to talk about every single country. But if you take, for example, a very heavily government-run system like the UK, like the English NHS, these steps become even more complex, because that step about defining the population we don't have a definition of the covered population under the English NHS, so we don't have a registration system that's comprehensive. So when I've worked with providers who are looking to take risk, we stumble even at that very first step of defining the population. So we struggle with defining the population, we struggle with defining the clinical population because the data isn't always granular enough to be able to do that. We struggle with defining the services, believe it or not. So because there is no benefit schedule for the UK, we can't even define the services that you're entitled to in any sort of granularity. We struggle with that baseline, that historical baseline and trends, because most of what's driving those trends is not demand side driven, it's supply side driven. So to the comment that was made in the audience about providers, I'm doing a project at the moment with my local hospital and their emergency department, and they're seeing trends increase at 5% year on year. It's got nothing to do with the local population, it's got nothing to do with health status, it's got nothing to do with any of the things that other providers are doing. What it has got to do, I believe, and nobody knows this definitively, is it's got to do with the fact that actually a lot of the community social care services have been cut for elderly people, and those people are not getting the help at home and they're ending up in the ER department. So if you were a provider taking risk and promising to reduce emergency visits, then you would have to be pretty brave to be taking risk on that kind of thing against the sort of backdrop of what's happening in the local system. When it comes to risk adjustment, we don't have great data in order to make risk adjustment for the local population. And if you think about monitoring and defining risk share and gain share provisions at a sort of local regional level, there is no real concept of savings. There is no way to define savings in a system where actually you're just getting an allocated budget and you spend that allocated budget in year. So those are just some of the sort of challenges to think about in specifically in the UK, but they also apply to other European systems. David, could you move on a couple of slides, please? Thank you. So I wanted to say a few words, and I'm sure most of you have seen this sort of analysis before, but a few words about the world market size for medical devices. Now, obviously, the US is by far the biggest, and that's where we would expect most of your resources to be concentrated on. But I wanted to highlight Germany specifically as a pretty big market, and Japan as a pretty big market. And the other thing I just wanted to say is that I'm not an expert in the Japanese system. I'm going to talk a little bit about Germany, but there's very limited use of value-based care outside the US. So everybody is talking about it. Very few people are doing it. And some of the challenges I highlighted for the UK are relevant in some of those systems. Other systems are really more about just the conservative nature of some of those systems and the difficulty in getting to grips on the payer side with a lot of the concepts that David talked about. So you as providers, as device manufacturers might look at those numbers and say, well, that example seems relatively simple. But as David alluded to, there's a heap of administrative management and monitoring that has to go into those kind of calculations. And most of the payers that we talk to, if they're government payers, they don't feel that confident in entering into those kinds of arrangements. And if they're private payers, then they're often just too small to be really engaged in that level of discussion. Could you move on to the next slide, David, please? Thank you. So a little bit here about how different payers think about costs and benefits. So David talked a little bit about return on investment studies. And that's definitely the most common approach that we see amongst private payers. And really the approach that they're taking is to say, we want to look purely at the financial costs and benefits of a new device or a new technology. So we want to look at what is this going to cost us over a specified time frame, and what are we going to save over that specified time frame. And really their fundamental question is, will this new medicine or technology increase or decrease my claims costs, and how can I mitigate some of the financial risks associated with claims cost inflation? And they're going to take a more or less long time frame depending on their particular position in the market, how stable their population is. But a big, in my experience, a big private insurer in a big market will have a relatively sophisticated approach to assessing new technologies, and they will have some kind of methodology that allows them to carry out, or at least assess, a return on investment calculation. Excuse me. And so they will be able to look at any pathway analysis you put in front of them. They'll be able to pull some data. They'll be able to say, this pathway is currently costing me X. If I put in this new device, it might cost me Y. They'll be able to have the sophistication to think about what a risk-sharing contract might look like. The sort of number of private insurers outside the US that can actually go through that process, I would have said, is fairly few. There are not a lot of the insurers that I work with that will be able to really quantify that and will be confident in going into some kind of value-based agreement. So it's not necessarily it's not necessarily something they don't think about, but it's something that they wouldn't necessarily have the confidence to go into, and they would worry about the paucity of the data that they might have and that monitoring element. But they at least would sort of intellectually understand the challenge. If we look at the cost effectiveness analysis, which is the most common approach that governments take, really they're looking at an incremental quality of life benefit metric, so such as a quality adjusted life year or something similar, that looks at what's the incremental health benefit I'm going to get for this new medicine or technology relative to the existing treatment regime. So their fundamental question really is, if I pay for this new technology or medicine, is it going to give me more health for my population relative to other ways I could spend my limited health budget? I mean, that's sort of intrinsically value-based, and in theory looks over a very long time frame. So the cost effectiveness analysis that's used by bodies such as the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, that is looking over a pretty long time frame. However, the irony of those kind of approaches is, while somebody like NICE at central government level, and this is true in many of the different countries that I work in, somebody at central government level is saying, let me carry out this cost effectiveness analysis and let me make a decision on whether or not I will reimburse this new device on the back of that cost effectiveness analysis. But that doesn't necessarily put the money to purchase that device into local budgets. So certainly it's the case in England that NICE will go through this entire cost effectiveness analysis, and then they will opine on whether or not the NHS should reimburse your particular medical device. But it's like an unfunded mandate. There's no money for that at a local level, so it doesn't necessarily follow that there will be any uptake of that at a local or regional level where the budgets are actually held. Next slide. So just some trends that were picked up by, this is a sort of McKinsey study, and some of the things that are affecting some of the medtech companies that we see in Europe. And one is around the focus of bodies such as NICE medtech as a source of potential saving money for government payers. And again, a sort of nice contrast with David's presentation on the US, in that we're talking about managing medical trend in the US, and the risk-sharing contracts that we see talk about mitigating medical trend. The risk-sharing contracts that are proposed or thought about in the UK tend to be around saving money. So they're not just saying, let's mitigate our medical trend from 1 year to next year. Maybe it's going to be 8% and we try and mitigate it by bringing it down to 5%. Actually, a lot of the things that we see are much, much more drastic than that, and actually have all kinds of inbuilt savings that actually say, well, last year we spent $100, but this year we're only going to spend $85 or $90 on the same service. So that's some of those things that you see are just utterly unrealistic, but that's the kind of backdrop that the government payers that we work with are sort of thinking about in the UK. Then there's a sort of price transparency. I'm not going to talk too much about that in the context of this presentation. And then this last part about integrated solutions. So NICE is looking at comparative cost effectiveness. They're looking at optimal treatment guidelines and therapy choices. So they're looking at that wider pathway cost. And so it's no longer sufficient to say, my device costs so this much more, but you're going to reap some rewards elsewhere. You're having to take into account the full clinical pathway and deliver some sort of value sort of beyond that product, but thinking about education, services, consultation, and maybe even financing to address some of the issues that those payers have. Next slide, please. A couple of comments on the German health system, because I said I would come back to that. So for those of you that don't know about the German health system, it's a private and a statutory health insurance. It is mandatory for German citizens. The vast majority are covered under one of the statutory health insurance schemes. And there's about 100 of those different statutory health funds. If you meet certain requirements on income and profession, you can opt out of those statutory funds and you can buy an equivalent private health insurance. So about 9 million Germans are covered by that private health insurance. It's a pretty big market. If you contrast that with the UK market, where actually it's now fewer than 10% of UK citizens actually have private health insurance, and our private health insurance is sort of complementary. It's not fully a substitute for the government system. But in Germany, the private health insurance is classed as a long-term insurance. However, it is, as you might expect, run by some relatively sophisticated big name insurance companies who will have the capacity and the processes to think about value-based contracting in theory. But again, it's very heavily regulated. And what you tend to find in the different markets that I work in is that you get sort of two extremes. You get small private markets, which are not heavily regulated, and there's a lot of freedom for private insurers to engage in alternative reimbursement mechanisms, but they don't necessarily have the sophistication or the scale to do that. And then you have much larger markets such as Germany, where because they are a large market and because they're covering first dollar healthcare rather than complementary health insurance, then it is very heavily regulated. And therefore, although in theory they have the scale and the capacity to enter into value-based contracts, in practice, it's very difficult for them to do so from a regulatory perspective. So just wanted to give you those two extremes. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk to this one in a lot of detail because I want people to have a chance to ask questions, but I just wanted to sort of highlight in here the many different ways that you can get reimbursed for a medical device, even on inpatient, and the next slide is on outpatient. And really what I wanted to highlight here is that every single country in Europe, and often down to a regional level, will have its own way of thinking about how they reimburse those medical devices. So although sort of safety regulation across Europe is fairly standardized, reimbursement methodologies and thinking through how and when and whether you can do some kind of value-based contract and what that looks like is very, very, very system specific. And there isn't a sort of one size fits all. So when David said earlier, you know, when you've seen one value-based contract, you've seen one value-based contract, I would go further and say, if you've seen one value-based contract in one country, you've seen one value-based contract in one country. It's very difficult to sort of make generalized comments. Next slide, please. And this is just the equivalent one for outpatient medical devices. So again, a sort of plethora of different evaluation methods, and that point on the top right about individual regional contracts is also really important, because as I said, often these things happen at a sub-national level. Certainly in the UK, those discussions for lots of devices will happen at a regional or at a very local level. And there won't necessarily be budgets for the purchase of those devices at that local level, even though at a national level, then it says they should be reimbursed. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to finish with a rare European case study for value-based reimbursement. I've done a bit of work in Spain a few years back, actually before this contract was implemented on a sort of a capitation, actually a local capitation contract. This one I thought was interesting. I don't have sort of inside knowledge of this one, but it was one that I found that I thought was worth highlighting. And this one was in Catalonia, a hospital procuring a service related to an implantable cardioverter defibrillator in a multi-year contract. And actually the contract that I worked on in Spain in, I think, 2014 was a multi-year capitation contract, which was very unusual at the time. It's very unusual to find a government happy to enter into a multi-year contract. And that's partly because in a lot of cases they are dispersing central government funds, and it's very difficult for them to commit to a multi-year time frame, which is another blocker for a lot of these contracts. So in this particular case, the Catalan agency looked at both the total cost of ownership and delivering outcomes beyond the device as core criteria for the tender, and the contract included the device, technical assistance and remote monitoring center, and payment was partly linked to the number of outpatient visits and complication rates. Now I've put here reported outcomes of a 10% drop in outpatient visits, a 10% reduction in complications, and increased collaboration along the care pathway. And I've highlighted that and I added the word reported because that was what was reported in the McKinsey study, and I wanted to just link that back to all the comments that David made earlier about what does that actually mean, and is that reported after risk adjustment? Is that reported against a specific benchmark? As actuaries, our sort of automatic reaction to any statistic like that is to want to dig into it and try and work out whether that is a credible statistic, how is it being calculated, and is that something that you would want to hang a value-based contract off of, because there are many, many, many different ways in which a 10% drop in outpatient visits could happen. It could be random, it could be something that happens in the community. I would say that most likely, most of the time, it is going to be for factors that are not directly related to the medical device, but there's going to be a plethora of other things going on that you're going to need to try and adjust for in any kind of value-based contract. And with that, I will wrap up. I'm happy to take questions.
So anyone who has questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. I think one of the biggest questions I've been getting individually from people is, will you be able to share these slides afterwards? Because they're incredible.
Yeah, I think
I'm sure we can.
I'm sure we can.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that would be a problem.
I think that would be great. I mean, this has been a ton of information. And, I will just say from my perspective, I've been on the product development side for the first 10 years of my career. And I always thought that side was risky. This is an eye opener for me from a risk perspective. It seems like it's very much a game of trying to figure out the best opportunity without exposing yourself to undue risk. So how would you all, even just from a very high level, getting started with this? Any tips, suggestions?
Yeah, so the first step will be, usually when people approach me, they've been getting some pushback from their contracts for fee for service about this is kind of expensive. And so what we learn as we kind of dig into it in the exploratory phase is that there's a product, there was some representation made in the marketing, and around that there's some definitions. So I usually start with kind of defining the scope of the device. Who's it being used on? What's it being used for? What's the outcome? What studies have you already got in place? What do your randomized control trials already look like? So the best place in a good story to start with is what you already know, and usually, usually when you're diagnosing, the first part of the problem as you're considering a new type of contract is, what issues have been brought up by others, and what is it you're trying to control for. So that's usually a great starting point.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I would just add that some of the biggest challenges that we have had isn't necessarily the modeling of the theoretical what if, which helps everybody around the table understand what might happen under different circumstances. But actually, often a significant challenge is just agreeing the starting point. So just agreeing that historical benchmark is often a challenge. So I have certainly sat in, I cannot tell you how many meetings in the NHS where we've talked about a potential way to reduce future hospital admissions. And then it turns out that round the table, which might include the local payer, the local commissioner, the local hospital provider, they don't actually have a unified view of how many admissions they paid for over the prior year, let alone what might happen next year. And if your starting point is off by, if you're looking at a change in admissions by maybe 5%, and your starting point is off by 2%, which is entirely possible, suddenly your risk contract is sort of torn to pieces because you were playing with 5% and now you're only playing with 3%. That's a big reduction.
So it's only as good as the data that they already have, is what you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and to help compensate for that, we have research data sets, at least in the US, that are very, very large, approaching 100 million people, that we can use to sort of help ground the analysis. So that's often where we go to first as well, is when we have the definition of the condition that we're treating and of the treatment that treats the condition. As those definitions clarify, we can dig around in current healthcare claims data and get a starting point, and the data is large enough that we're pretty comfortable that it's a kind of a solid. So that's one of the first places we go when we look at it.
So I think we did get a question come in, because I won't ask my question, but maybe if we have time. Actually, this was Julia. You just sent me a question. That was my question exactly. At what stage of development do people start considering actually your services, right? Assuming earlier is better, but my question was too, we work with a ton of small companies. When do they start having to think about this?
So in the device manufacturers that we've worked with that are small, particularly that are small or that are developing a product, it's not, so I have two opinions, and some of it's workable and some of it's not very workable. It's not too early if you're considering a value-based or an alternate price risk-based contract to think about gathering some of the endpoints that you would be using in your contract during the control trial phases of it. The problem is that every time you add an endpoint to a randomized control trial, you increase the cost of the control trial fairly dramatically. So that's the challenge. But if you're going to be measuring and making statements about return on investment and changes in healthcare delivery as a result of your treatment, it would be nice to collect some of those endpoints as you're doing your evaluation for the FDA. That's a nice to have, but again, the challenge is that every element of measure that you add to it is expensive to add. So once you have your FDA approval, then your marketing starts and your strategies for marketing start. If it's going to be a high value product, you know, there's a couple of ways you can go about it. You can try it. If it's really popular, you may not want or need to go to a risk-based contract because of the expense involved in getting it set up, and just see where you're going to go. But if you're really struggling for market share, then you want to approach your payers early with a proposal that says, I think we can save you money. We want some increased market share as a result. Let's make a deal and then start that negotiation. So it depends on, how quickly you think you can gain market share and gain traction. And part of that depends on the competition and also an anticipation of how much pushback on the price you're going to get when you enter the market. I think those are sort of the places. I don't think it's in the very beginning that you start talking, but I think it's before you actually start mass producing the product for distribution that you at least start thinking about it.
That's awesome. I think that's right up on time. So, and I think the one more question was from the audience is, and I think this is a yes, you do work with early stage companies to help figure all of this out, at least from a very early perspective.
Yeah. There was one question that came up, just as sort of an interesting one, is how do we, so if you have something that predicts a service and then you can do something to avoid it, I'm thinking we had one product where we were predicting seizures. The device predicted seizures and called a caregiver to the side, and it involved reducing emergency room visits and other services that might occur, so a reduction in healthcare costs. How do you value that in a value-based contract? And that feels like an avoidance. And there's a lot of predictive models out there coming up now, so it's a kind of an up-and-coming technology. A lot of mobile devices and wearables and things like that. I think those are cost avoidance things that require a great benchmark is probably where I would start in thinking about those. So I thought that was a great question, and it is really pertinent to today's environment and what's being developed.
That's great. And I think I'm getting a lot of feedback from the audience, especially, is that they'd love to follow up with you. So David, you would be the right person to reach out to with questions and to chat about opportunities?
Yeah, start with me, particularly if you're US based. If you have a particular question that's related to the European market, then feel free to contact Joanne. And we will, how do we make sure everybody has our contact information?
So what I'll do is once you guys have the slides cleaned up and are willing to share them, I will send everyone the video of today's recording along with slides. And if it's okay, I'll include your contact information and then make sure that all the participants get it. Right.
And somebody just reminded me that there's our email addresses in case you want to just give us an email.
Oh, there you go. They're right on the screen as well. So that's perfect. Well, great. We are right at 11 o'clock. So that is absolute perfect timing. David, Joanne, thank you both so much. This was a lot of information. It was really good information. And I think something that's going to be incredibly beneficial for the folks who attended and everyone in our community that we're able to share this with. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you later this week at more programming. Have a good one.